we have a mitzvah. The mitzvah, God says, is to raise funds for the tabernacle. But the language in verse 8, V'asu mikdash v'shachanti b'socham. Make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell amongst them, or in their midst. That's one verse. There's another biblical verse in Devarim where it describes how the Jewish people, Moshe is telling them what they should do and what they're going to do. These are the laws that you should keep when you enter the land of Israel. And let's go further down. And among the things that he says, you'll cross the Jordan, verse 11, and it will be that the place that the Lord your God will choose in which to establish his name, there you shall bring all that I am commanding you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifice, your tithe, your separation by your hand, and the choice of vows that you will vow to the Lord. So there is a description that there will be a place that God will choose, which we understand from many verses later on in the Torah and the prophets, referring to Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. And there you shall bring the sacrifices, and where God will choose to l'shakein, to establish his name, to rest his name. The divine presence is used, the Shechina, same word, to dwell there. Now, this place called the Temple Mount, according to tradition, it is where Adam is formed. Adam, the first human being, is formed there. And God transplants him to the Garden of Eden in order that atonement be built into our very DNA. Another idea that's more familiar to everyone else, it's not just it's explicitly in the text almost, where Avraham goes to Mount Moriah. And Mount Moriah is called Hamakom, the same language, the place that I will choose. You see here, verse 11. The Makom is the same language used when Avram comes to Mount Moriah to bind his son Isaac as an offering. So, and then God saves Isaac and puts a ram in it instead. But the key idea there is that sacrifice is built into the very fabric from Avram and Yitzchak, bringing themselves as offering. That becomes the future place of the temple. And we find other cases, it says, where Yaakov hits the place, Vayifka v'makom, he bumps into the spot, hamakom, again, the same word, the spot. What's the spot? With a big H, with a big A, with a very definitive the in front of it. Jacob, and he has a dream of the ladder, and he says, oh, I did not know. This is the gateway to heaven, and this is the house of the Lord. In other words, Yaakov is also there. So from the beginning of creation and from the beginning of the Jewish people, it is there. And it is said that Yaakov takes, pours. It is said that in the Holy of Holies, there was a rock called the foundation stone. And this foundation stone, in the period, in the end of the first temple, when they no longer had the Ark of the Covenant, and then later on the second temple, it was on that stone they would put the incense on Yom Kippur. This stone, some say, is where the Dome of the Rock is over. The Dome of the Rock is covering it. But this stone is seen as the seed from which God created the physical world. The physical earth is, so to speak, grown from that seed. And this is the center of it all. The eye, the black part of the eye, if Jerusalem is the eye, this is the image in the eye, the black dot in the eye. In other words, this is the core and center. I just want to share a medrash with you, just to put things in perspective a little bit. It said, if the nations of the world understood that the heart of the universe was the temple and the Jewish service in the temple, they would have put soldiers around it to protect it from being destroyed, rather than, of course, destroying it themselves. In other words, the temple is not just good for the Jews, it's good for the world. As a matter of fact, on Sukkot, we would bring up 70 bulls for the nations of the world, both to bring blessings down to them, but also to mitigate the negativity that exists in the outside world. But it would also bring blessings for them. So this idea that, a matter of fact, King Shlomo says that when a Gentile comes and prays in this place, his prayers should be answered, even if they may not be in the long term good, because he does not want a desecration of God's name that someone says, I came there and the prayers were not effective. Let the prayers be effective. For the Gentiles, he says, even if long term it's not good. For the Jew who'll still trust in God, better make sure, this is Solomon's prayer, that if it's long term not going to be a good outcome of this thing the person thinks is good for him, better not to give it. In other words, God wants to give what's best for us. And Solomon is davening that, you know what, when Gentiles come, they're going to desecrate God's name by saying the prayers were not effective if what they prayed for they didn't get. The point is, Gentiles would come there and they would daven and they would bring korbanos. There were certain areas where they could go, which happens to be the same place we're allowed to go on the Temple Mount. We even if we're impure from coming in contact with a dead body, which we'll come to. This doesn't mean that it's a good thing to go up. We'll come to that. But I'm just saying, technically, from a legal point of view, the Gentile could go to a certain place in the temple. And I sent out that email with that stone. That stone was placed at the area where if a Jew went and was impure, his soul would be cut off from heaven. And there, it says here, the Gentile, if his death would be in his own hands, whether that meant there would be a court or from heaven. It doesn't say on that stone that I sent him the email, which was in Greek, but it was written for the Gentiles to know, because Gentiles would come to the temple. Okay, so we have here, I want to go for a moment just to get a little bit of perspective here. I want to go to the laws first of building a temple. So Maimonides is a codifier. He took all the Talmudic laws and all the halachic midrash, and he synthesized it and he developed it, and he made 1,000 beautiful chapters with 10,000 laws, everything set up so perfectly. And we're concluding now, at this period, we're concluding the yearly cycle of learning the Rambam. So it's a good time if anyone wants to start learning the, maybe not all three chapters a day is a cycle to finish in a year. One chapter lets you finish in 3 years. And you could also do the Book of Commandments that he created, which was really a way of organizing the entire structure of his magnum opus, which is called the Mishnah Torah or Yad HaChazaka. So for example, his Book of Mitzvot gave him a format to be able to organize this. So if you take a look, the 8th book, which is a book of service, it contains 9 sets of laws, and this is their order. He has the 9 sets. The first one is the laws of the chosen house, the Beit HaBechira. And in the Beit HaBechira, there are 6 commandments, 3 positive and 3 negative. So people study, in order to keep up with the people who are studying 3 chapters a day, they study for the Book of Mitzvot that has been reformatted to align with the daily study. So I will add that to our email. And those who want to start, you can do audio lessons or text in your email. Okay. But here's his mitzvah. It is a positive commandment to construct a house for God, prepared for sacrifices to be offered within. We must celebrate there 3 times a year, as Exodus states, and you shall make me a sanctuary. He quotes here the verse that we read in our Torah portion, V'asu li mikdash. You should make for me a sanctuary. Just by the way, it doesn't say mishkan, tabernacle. It actually says mikdash. That's the language that's used in the Torah. Then he says the sanctuary constructed by Moses is already described in the Torah. It was only temporary. As Deuteronomy states, for at present you have not come unto the resting place and the inheritance. But when you come to that resting place and inheritance, so then you will be able to build a permanent home. And here we have a brief history. After the Jews entered the land of Israel, they erected a sanctuary in Gilgal for 14 years and in Shiloh, and they built it. The tabernacle was wood covered in gold, and above it was skins and woven wool coverings and goat coverings. But then they built a house of stone and they put the curtains over it. The sanctuary of Shiloh stood for 369 years. When Eli died, it was destroyed. They built another sanctuary. When Samuel died, it was destroyed. They came to Givon, then, which is 57 years. And then they built the temple in Jerusalem. And once the temple is built in Jerusalem, no more backyard altars. It used to be people, Jews, were able to bring their own sacrifices in anywhere they wanted. But once there was a temple, it became forbidden to build a sanctuary for God or offer sacrifice in any other place. The zoning boards were very happy. Trust me, if they had a problem with the synagogue, they'd have problems with you bringing sacrifices in your backyard. The only sanctuary for all generations is Jerusalem, and specifically on Mount Moriah. And King David bought it. An interesting midrash. It says in the future times, the Gentiles of the world are going to claim the land of Israel, and they're going to start with the three areas that the Jewish people actually bought, and they didn't just conquer. We find Abraham buys the resting place of for Sarah, and ultimately the patriarchs are buried there. And according to tradition, Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, were also buried there. In other words, earlier that was the spot. The scent of the Garden of Eden was there when Avram discovered it, or rather, according to the Midrash, Yishmael may have discovered it when they're bringing, when they're trying to feed the angels. When the angels come, the cow gets away, according to the Midrash, and they follow it, and it's this cave within a cave where Adam is lying there, and Avram says, this is where I want to put my wife, where I want to be laid to rest, and Sarah to be laid to rest. But there's another place that was bought. Yaakov buys the field in Shechem. He buys that area. And King David purchases the Temple Mount. Even though he had conquered the area, the Temple Mount, he actually purchases. So the Medrash says these three areas are going to be the first place the Gentiles in the future are going to demand back. You know what they are? If you remember, the Y agreement was Hebron first, Hebron, then Nablus, Shechem, and then Jerusalem they're going after. In other words, this prophecy was said 1,500 years ago at least, that in the future time, when they're going to demand from the Jews. Now, in those days, the Jews didn't have any of the land of Israel anymore. There was a prophecy about what would be happening today, that they're first going to go for Shechem, Nablus, Shechem, Hebron, and Yerushalayim. And you see, that's where we are today. All right. So he says here, and this is going to be one of the interesting issues, the design built by King Solomon is described explicitly in the Book of Kings. That was temple number 1. In contrast, the design of the Messianic temple, although mentioned in the book of Ezekiel, is not explicit or explained. It means, in other words, if you look at the book of Yecheskel, it is not clear. There are elements there that are hard to understand. And in some ways, the design of the third temple will be different than the first temple. So he says the people in the time of Ezra built a hybrid. They built the second temple according to the structure of Solomon, including certain aspects which are explicitly stated in Ezekiel. So on one hand, they built it like the second temple, and then they had other elements which are explicitly stated in Ezekiel. Yecheskel. Okay. I want to do one more piece from Maimonides. Oh, we have a chat. Someone asked a question. Yeah, so Wayne is asking. So the city was conquered, but there were still individuals or a tribe living in that area. So they bought it from them, that field. Okay? All right, so going back here for a second. So in the Book of Kings, in the future, the Messianic king will arise and renew the Davidic dynasty, restoring it to its initial sovereignty. He will build the temple and gather the dispersed of Israel. Then in his days, the observance of all the statutes returned to the previous state. We will offer sacrifices, observe the sabbatical and jubilee years, all the particulars are described in the Torah. Okay, then, in other words, what Maimonides is going to do is bring back the Torah the way it was from the beginning. But now, an interesting element here. Okay, take a look. How do we know who Messiah will be. One should not, according to the Maimonides, one should not presume that the Messianic king must work miracles and wonders, bring about new phenomena, resurrect the dead, and perform other similar deeds. This is definitely not true. Mashiach does not have to do miracles. He could be a holy leader who is successful militarily and politically. Proof can be brought from the fact that in about the year 135, there was a revolt against Rome. Rabbi Akiva supported the king Bar Kokhba, as he's known. And he felt this man was a messianic king. He and all the sages, Maimonides says, he and all others say the majority, others disagree with Maimonides, but Maimonides believes, and he says, that the sages of the generation considered him the messianic king until he was killed because of sins. Once he was killed, they realized he was not the Mashiach, but they did not ask any signs or wonders. This is Maimonides. Others disagree and say Mashiach will have to do wonders. But the point is, according to the Rambam, he says the main thrust of the matter is, oh, we're missing the, hold on, there's a beautiful piece here. It's probably in the additional sections. 1 second. All right. Oh, here it is, the next piece. Pretty radical piece here. Okay. The main thrust of the matter is the Torah and its statutes and its laws are everlasting. We may not add to them or detract from them. So now he says, how do you know who the Messiah will be? So according to Maimonides, and here's the issue. According to Maimonides, the order is important, that the temple is not built before the Messiah proves himself. So he says like this, if a king, first and foremost, a ruler, will arise from the house of David, and he studies the Torah and keeps its commandments like King David, and he fixes the breaches in his observance and fights the wars of God, and he compels all of Israel to walk in the ways of Torah. He compels, whether it's through a system of law or through his great ability to convince people. Mashiach has to get people to return to Torah. And then you could work with the assumption, if he fights the war of God, that we could consider Mashiach. In other words, there is something called an assumptive Mashiach. You can assume it. If he succeeds in the above, builds a temple in his place, and gathers dispersed of Israel, he's definitely the Mashiach. So if we follow that Maimonides' order is important, so first is these things, then building the temple in its place, and then gathering the dispersed of Israel. In other words, the ingathering of the exiles. He says the next step will be he'll improve the entire world, that everyone will call out to God. Initially, there'll be wars, but then everyone. And he says the Mashiach does not succeed, and he is killed, then he's not the Redeemer promised. He's a potential one, a kosher one, a wonderful, good king, a righteous, but as it says in the prophets, and some of the wise men will stumble at that time. But then he says, this is an amazing piece. It's not really relevant to what we're doing, but just such an amazing thing. This was taken out by the censors. So you're seeing the uncensored version of Maimonides. He wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, who aspired to the Messiah and was executed by the court. He doesn't say which court, but the assumption Maimonides is by the Jewish court, okay? Not by the Romans. Whether it means that the Jewish court, which were not doing death penalty at the time, gave him over to the Romans. Maimonides says he's killed in court. Could be it means, some might say it means the Roman court, but he says here it is a biblical prophecy about that they're vulgar among your people shall exalt themselves and attempt to fill the vision, but they shall stumble. So the Maimonides says, can there be a bigger stumbling block than Christianity? All the prophets spoke of Mashiach as the Redeemer of Israel and their Savior, who would gather to disperse and strengthen the observance of mitzvahs. In contrast, Christianity caused the Jews to be slain by the sword, the remnants to be scattered and humbled, the Torah to be altered, and the majority of the world to err and serve a God other than the Lord. This Trinity thing is not okay. Nevertheless, he says, the intent of the Creator of the world is not within the power of man to comprehend. For his ways are not our ways, nor are his thoughts our thoughts. Ultimately, all the deeds of Jesus of Nazareth and the Ishmaelite, Islam and Christianity who rose after him will only serve to prepare the way for Mashiach's coming. So Christianity and Islam have tortured the Jews. Maimonides is saying, but, There's something positive here. What is the positive thing? They've prepared the entire world for Mashiach's coming, motivating the nation to serve God together. In other words, what's going to happen? Mashiach will come. Mashiach will improve the world and motivate everyone to serve God together. How will this come about? The entire world already knows about Messiah. The Christians have been talking about it ad nauseum. They've been talking about the Torah and mitzvot. They just say, oh, it was overruled. These matters have been spread the furthest most islands to many stubborn-hearted nations. There are tiny isles around the world. Everyone's heard of the Bible. They discuss these matters, the Torah, saying these mitzvahs were true, but were negated in the present age and not applicable all time. Or they say in the mitzvot are hidden concepts that cannot be understood simply. The Mashiach has come and revealed those hidden secrets. But he says like this, when the real Messiah will come and prove successful, everyone then, his position become exalted, they will all return, humanity will return, and realize the ancestors down there with a false heritage, and the prophets and ancestors caused them to err. They'll be like, oh, we got it somewhat. We just don't have it all. We have it somewhat. Okay, I'm going to share a short video about the temple, just to give us a second. It's going to be this one. Okay, I'm going to make it full screen. I hope everyone can see it.
God told the Jews at Sinai to build a temple so that his presence could dwell among them, a place to worship, to gather as a nation, to receive atonement, inspiration, and instruction. Half a millennium later, God's desired location for a permanent home was revealed to King David in the ancient city of Jerusalem, atop a hillside known during Abrahamic times as Mount Moriah. David's son, King Solomon, completed a magnificent structure that attracted the title Beit HaMikdash and Beit HaPirah. It was fashioned with much gold, expensive woods, and precious materials. When it was completed in 827 BCE, the nation gathered to witness God's presence fill the temple. The mountain gained a new name, Har Habayit. At its summit, a stone building rose to enormous height. Within its gaping entrance was the Ulam, a lobby, beyond which was the Kodesh, furnished with 3 golden items, an altar for incense, a 7-branched menorah, and a table with racks for the showbread. At the sanctuary's far end, a separated area enclosed the temple's core, its most sacred location, the Kodesh HaKodashim, that held the Aron, the Ark of God, containing the tablets that Moses delivered at Sinai. The Ark of God rested upon a naturally protruding plateau known as the Foundation Rock. Immediately outside the building, the courtyard of the Kohanim, priests, held a massive stone sacrificial altar with a lengthy access ramp. Nearby was the Kior, a cistern for rinsing hands and feet, and a platform for the Levites to chant psalms and play instruments. Further back, a larger area was designed for public assembly, known as the Women's Courtyard. It included an extensive wooden balcony for women. The nation would gather 3 times each year to celebrate the festivals of Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. The compound was surrounded by a massive wall and contained a series of steps, numerous gateways and guard posts. The temple's layout was exceptionally efficient, with compartments and chambers for every possible need, such as storage areas for wood, oil, and other materials, production and preparation areas, rooms for clothing, for weaponry in case of attack, ritual immersion pools, sleeping and eating areas, tool and instrument reserves, lockers for the priests, a charity room, a hall for Torah study, a chamber for the Sanhedrin, a lounge for temple officials, a repair workshop, animal holdings, ticket stations, and so on. There were separate entrances for distinct purposes, an oversight system, and honor guards. A small stream ran beneath the temple, which was used to maintain cleanliness. The temple stood for 4 centuries. It was destroyed by the Babylonian army in 423 BCE, rebuilt in 349 BCE, and stood for 4 centuries more until it was destroyed by the Romans in 69 of the Common Era. Through his prophets, God promised the Jews a third and eternal temple in the Messianic era, from which his presence will spread to the world, embracing all of humanity.
Okay, I'm gonna just open this up a little bit, and there's a group in Israel called the Temple Mount Faithful, and they promote the idea of going up onto the Temple Mount. They also have there's a institute called Machon HaMikdash, which is the Temple Institute, where they're creating vessels for the future use of the temple. So I want to deal with both these issues separately, and just a little bit of history. The history of the Islam originally, and even till relatively recently, saw the Temple Mount as being special because it was Solomon's temple. It was called Al Mikdash. It was they even called Jerusalem by that name. But the temple was the holy spot because it was the temple of Jerusalem. And you even have from the early part of the century, of the 20th century, you have the Islamic Waqf and other groups writing about the history of the Temple Mount, connecting it to Judaism. There's been an attempt to sever the Jewish connection. One of the things that was done was they emptied 300 tons of material, the Muslims digging underneath the Temple Mount in an area called Solomon Stables. They dumped 300 tons of debris, which included in it remnants from the First Temple and Second Temple period. So the Temple Sifting Project began to go through that. But this is one of the things, an Israeli court ruled that they were deliberately destroying the Jewish connection to the Temple Mount. But Israel, for various reasons, did not want to pick a fight over this, and this has been an ongoing challenge. So there is a Temple Sifting Project where they uncover elements from the First and Second Temple. On the Temple Mount today, there still are elements that are from First and Second Temple. And like the email I sent, they have that image of that stone written in Greek for the Gentiles. So we have these physical remnants. They found recently a bell or pomegranate bell from the high priest's hem. But so you have these different groups with different belief systems. I want to go to the political scene for a moment. The political scene was in 1967, the Jews conquer the Temple Mount. And the area where Jews have been forbidden to pray in front of the Kotel was cleared, and rows of houses and streets were bulldozed in order to make the temple, the Kotel Plaza. But the Temple Mount itself, Moshe Dayan, who was not known for his sensitivity to Judaism, decided to give it to the Waqf, which was a Jordanian-run religious organization. So he basically, shortly after the victory in 67, he basically gave over the rulership and ownership, if you will, or at least the running of it, to this Muslim group instead of keeping it for Israel. Now, part of the problem is that if you don't assert ownership over Jerusalem and over the parts of Israel that are biblically yours, you have a hard time when you're trying to assert that claim in other locations. On the other hand, now that things are the way they are, it's not a mitzvah to stir the pot necessarily. It's not a mitzvah to go if there's no pressing need for us to be doing things with the Temple Mount. So it's an important element, is that not every right has to be exercised. So for example, the land of Israel, like we learned last week, can be broader than what we own right now, but it's not necessarily a mitzvah to go and conquer it today. If it's in your possession, it might be prohibited to give it up unless life is in danger. And our argument last week was, of course, that experience and military expertise and many other things have shown us that giving up strategic depth and giving up land is a danger to us. It doesn't allow more peace, but it causes more death. But the issue becomes, like with the Temple Mount, just because it may belong to you, it doesn't always mean there's a mitzvah to go and exercise your rights to it. So first, the history. So the history is that element. Now, about going up the Temple Mount, the problem is if you are impure, there are different levels of impurity, but there are for sure places a Jew who had come in contact with a dead body, or if you'd been in any room with a dead body. So if you've ever been in a hospital, you ever been, or everyone has walked over a grave or been in a hospital or something like that, would be impure, ritually impure, and that parts you're not allowed to go onto parts of where the temple was. One cannot go, and a Gentile is also not allowed to go in the same places where a Jew is impure is not allowed to go. So there are many that say we don't know exactly where the temple was on the Temple Mount. Others say we do know. And therefore, the ones who say we don't know say don't go up at all. The ones who say we do know, some of them say we should go up. Others say even if you think you do know, are you sure you know? There are different opinions about where things were. And we're talking about a mitzvah where if you break it, your soul's cut off. It's like eating on Yom Kippur. So they say, no, we're very careful. We only go in certain areas and under rabbinic guidance. And others say, if you're being careful, if the doors open up and lots of Jews go up, who says they're going to be careful? And that's not a positive thing to trample on the spots of holiness if you're impure. And there are many laws associated with purity as well, even if some of them you could keep today. Not all of them, but even if there are some and certain ways of behaving. So the vast majority, until the recent past, of rabbis were very much emphatically against it. Like I said, today there's a movement in Israel to go up there. Now, in Israel's not a religious state. It's a secular state. So the secular government has rules that Jews cannot wear tefillin there, cannot wear talis there. They're not supposed to pray there. They're doing some form of silent prayer now without talis and tefillin. I think they allow them now. But the point is that, again, not necessarily is in other words, if you would ask ideally, Jews and Gentiles shouldn't go in that section of the temple. In other words, if you're talking about from a Jewish law point of view, so it would be a problem for Gentiles to be there as well, just like Jews who are impure. There's no difference. So sometimes people say, secular Jews say, what do you mean Jewish law says you're not allowed to go up? It's true, Jewish law says you're not allowed to go up, but Jewish law says also the Gentile can't go up. So if the Jews would have had control then in the beginning, it may have made sense not to allow anyone to go up to the Temple Mount at that point. Once they gave it up, is not necessarily a necessity to go and take it back. So let's talk about building. So going up to the temple, I would say vast majority still say no. There's a significant minority that's growing today, supported by the Temple Institute and by the Temple Mount Faithful and other such groups that are promoting this idea. I would say in general, the classic halachic approach would be not to go up there and to be, the kotel, to be at the kotel, which is the retaining wall of the Temple Mount built by Herod. The question about building the temple is a fascinating question. So we had a second temple built by Ezra the scribe. So Jews built the temple. The question, first of all, is the third temple intrinsically different from the first and second? We say every day in our prayers from the Song of the Sea that the temple that was part of Plan A for the Jews when they left Sinai, getting the Torah. Even before they got to Sinai, when they're going through the splitting of the sea, they say Mikdash Adonai Konu Yedecha, the temple of the Lord established by your hands. And the belief is, according to some, it's in the Talmud and it's how Rashi understands it, that the third temple will be built by God. Built by God. Others, Maimonides, like we just read, says Messiah will build it. Now, does it mean Messiah himself, or will he lead the people in building? Seemingly, it would make sense. He would lead the people in building it. Doesn't have to be done miraculously. Maimonides himself said Messiah doesn't have to do miracles, so therefore he would be the one leading it. There's another element you do need to know to put the altar in the proper place. Some say you would need a prophet to figure out where it was. Now, the second temple, they did have prophets among them who could have told them where to put certain things in the second temple. But again, the second temple becomes a question about this building that they did. How is it different than the third temple? So the third temple, which is yet to be, is supposed to be eternal. So it has to be built by God, is the argument, because if it's built by human beings who are finite, it will come to an end. But God himself will do it. But how do we reconcile that with the other opinions that say that human beings have to build it? So there are different approaches. I'm gonna run through a few. One is that there's a heavenly Jerusalem and there's a heavenly temple. Our good deeds, our mitzvot, we were told as children, put another brick in the wall of the temple above. And that temple of fire, whether that is the concept, though, is true, that there's a temple above, a spiritual temple that will come down, and we'll build a physical one, and it will be imbued like soul into a body. There'll be a meshing of the spiritual and the physical at this portal between the physical and the spiritual. That's one approach. Another approach is, well, it depends. Like many of the laws connected to the building of the temple, like many of the laws and traditions connected with the arrival of Mashiach, there is a tradition from the prophets that says, in its time, I will hasten it. And the Talmud says, how could it be in its time and hasten? And the Talmud explains different contradictions in the prophetic text by saying, if you merit, it will be hastened. If not, it will come in its time. So using that model, some people would say, if we merit, God will build it. If we don't merit, then we'll build it ourselves. In other words, it depends. Mashiach will come. The question is, will it be a way of merit or a way of not merit? In a way that we have all the greatness, or will it be in a more physical, mundane process versus this divine revelation from on high that will come down, in other words, and change everything in a blink of an eye. So the question now becomes, okay, let's understand Messiah will build it. But 1 second, can we build it? Are we allowed to? If we're controlling the Temple Mount, are we allowed to build a third temple? It seems that the Jews that came up with Ezra built a temple. The story of Yeshua ben Hananiah, that he's like 30, 40 years after the destruction of the temple, and the evil Roman Empire who destroyed the temple gave him permission to build it. And all the Jews gathered around, the Midrash tells the story, all the Jews gathered around, they gathered money, they gathered resources, and they come there. And in the interim, the Kutim, the Samaritans, who in our tradition are anything but good Samaritans, the Samaritans were always jostling for power or position in Israel because the Jewish people, majority, had been exiled. The Samaritans had stayed in the land. So they put their roots down, and they were not happy when the Jews came back 70 years later. Sounds familiar? So the Kutim, who were these hybrid Jews, they're the Samaritans. They kept certain things. They have some of the Torah they took. And there was debate about their Jewish status over the ages. And it really depends on what period we're talking about. But be that what it may, they come to the king and say, the Jews plan a rebellion against you. He says, what do you mean? He says, they're going to rebel against you. They need their temple so that they have their center of spiritual power, if you will. It's your first act of rebellion. And the king says, how do you know? They said, we'll prove it to you. Tell them to move the temple a little bit over and don't put it in the exact spot where they want to build it. And you'll see that they're not going to listen to you. And that's the proof they're not going to listen to you. Because what kind of foolish thing is it not to put it? Because they knew, Jewish law says, The temple has to be in the exact proper spot. So the king did that. And he said to the Jews, move the temple over a little bit. I like it. Let's call it Trump Palace. No, he didn't say that. He said, let's move it over a little bit. And the Jews refused. He said, okay, no more building the temple. And there was talk among the Jews of leading a revolt then against Rome. They had their hopes rise so high, and now it was dashed. So the rabbi who was leading them at the time said, let me tell you a parable. There once was a lion who had a bone stuck in his throat. You may be familiar with this parable. And he said, who will remove the bone from my throat? I'll give it a great reward. And a certain bird came over, stuck his long neck into the lion's mouth, and plucked out the bone. And then he said to the king, where's my reward? To the lion. And the lion said, your reward? You're lucky I didn't bite your head off. You had your head in my mouth. I could have snapped it in a second. Your reward is you could tell people that you had your head in my mouth and you survived. You'll have a story to tell at your cocktail parties. Be happy with that reward. He said, this guy destroyed the temple. He did many other horrific things, and he was going to do other horrific things. Be happy we survived this. Let's not push our luck. But the implication there seems to be that you're allowed to rebuild the temple. So some say it was right after the second temple was destroyed, not much later. It would have been seen as a continuation of the second temple. That's the idea. So therefore, it would have been different than us building it today. So, and there are many other opinions about this issue, about A, is it a commandment for us to build it? B, can we do it without a prophet? C, even if it's not a commandment, are we allowed to do it today? So there are these different legal approaches. Maimonides codifies seemingly pretty clearly that this is how the Rebbe understood it, that the order will first be building of the temple and then ingathering of the exiles. This does lead to an interesting thing. Oh, there's another element that the mitzvah of building the temple really comes, if you look at Maimonides, after two other mitzvot. One is setting up the kingship, and the other is wiping out Amalek. So wiping out Amalek has never been that clear. We didn't know who Amalek was, although now there are people that are vying for that position by trying to sacrifice their own children in the attempt to kill Jews. But nevertheless, biblical Amalek without a prophet, without knowing who they are, is not a simple thing. But to have the kingship first over Israel, so even one of the great religious Zionist leaders, who you would think was more inclined to the concept of a temple on the Temple Mount even before the physical Mashiach, he said, well, first you got to bring back kingship. You got to have Jewish rulership. You got to have the commandments going back. I'll come to the questions afterwards a little bit. Going back for a second. So what this religious Zionist Rav Kook said, his son, Tzvi Yehuda, he said, let's first take care of the kingship. That the land should be run according to Jewish law before you start jumping with a temple. You know, Herzl had a vision of a temple also in Jerusalem, but it was idea, of whatever his vision of a temple was, but it was part of this nationalism. You need to have a religious cult. You need a religious group, so you got to put it in there because it's a religious component, like Church of England. In Judaism, the very center of the whole return that we pray for is the temple, and everything flows from that. It's the heart of everything. We say on Tisha B'Av, we say, Nachem, God should comfort us, because the city of Jerusalem lies in ruins, and everything is turned over, and we need the Messiah. So the question they ask, what do you mean to ruins? Jerusalem has never been bigger. So the understanding across the board is that everyone should still say this prayer, because the core of what's devastated is the temple. In other words, the temple is what makes Jerusalem Jerusalem. Everything else is, so to speak, the accoutrements of the setting of the stone, But the stone, the core, is going to be the temple in Jerusalem. So in other words, this idea that the temple is a place where God revealed himself and that we want it rebuilt is central to Judaism. And here's a problem for modern man, it's a problem. Because the idea of animal sacrifice, we'll have to discuss another time, a temple in a very specific spot that God says, here's where I want to reveal my presence. Just like the land of Israel is holy, and Jerusalem is holy, and the temple is holy, the Holy of Holies is a place where God will be revealed. I want that home for me. There's no question Jews look forward to that. The question is, are we allowed to build that today? Again, Maimonides would seem to imply there's an order. First comes the building of the temple, then the ingathering of the exiles by Messiah. Mashiach has to be the one to initiate it. This leads to an interesting element, is that according to that interpretation, which the Rebbe held of as well, that all the Jews that are gathered today in Israel are not yet considered the ingathering of the exiles. The ingathering of the exiles will happen after the temple is built, when the rest of Jews will come to Israel. So even though right now we're almost at a tipping point where the majority of Jews soon in the world will be in Israel, and that will change many of the laws of Israel, still the Rebbe's reading of Maimonides and others as well, but it's not across the board, would argue that first Mashiach has to come, a human being, who will do what he has to do, the preliminaries, which is get the Jews to keep Torah and mitzvot. Then he'll conquer the nations around him. Then he'll build a temple, and then he'll do the ingathering of the exiles. Now, the truth is, in your prayer book, the order is not like Maimonides, but the prayer book is not a book of law, and it's not always consistent and harmonious with every decision of Jewish law. But there are, again, opinions that would take Maimonides' own words, where he says in another place, he says, not everything in the order about what will happen when Messiah will come is known until Elijah the prophet will come and he'll set us straight, or until it happens, rather, when it does. But specifically, he does speak of the order that first has to be is a king, and then Amalek, and then the temple. So that's pretty specific according to Maimonides. So all things being pulled together, I would say from a Chabad perspective, the Rebbe's perspective, the reading of the Rambam, is that Mashiach will do it. Others will say maybe Jews would be allowed to, but not everything you're allowed to do should you do. In other words, we are in exile. In other words, here's an important element. I know this is also difficult for people on both sides of the spectrum, politically, the left and the right. We, as Jews, believe the land of Israel is ours, God's gift to us. That does not mean necessarily we have to risk lives to conquer more of the land of Israel. As a matter of fact, an argument can be made that not necessarily was it always ideal to move into different areas of the land of Israel where there was risk to life, because the mitzvah to live in the land of Israel today, according to many authorities, does not include war, does not include risking your life. So anytime you created a situation which may cause more danger, it would not be appropriate. Once we're in the land, it's a mitzvah not to give away land. That's true. It's a mitzvah not to endanger lives, which would mean make sure that the military opinions are followed as far as what we need for security, and not political fantasies. And even the military, following the military in the field, not those sitting back at headquarters already jostling for political positions. Because Torah law tells us you follow a doctor, not a professor, not a theoretical medical professional. When it comes to finding out health laws, you speak to someone in the field, same way with the military. Now, there's a mitzvah not to start up, not to, what's a good word, instigate with the Gentiles. In other words, even if it says don't even start up with a lowly Gentile. In other words, for no reason, just because you have authority doesn't mean you always have to exercise it. There are ramifications and there are consequences at times. On the other hand, when you express weakness, at times that invites more attack. So sometimes there are questions about what should have been done at certain times and what should be done now. In other words, in 1967, when the Arabs expected the Jews were going to massacre them after, because they were going to do that to the Jews. That was their plan. They were all sharpening their knives, and they were going to kill the Jews. The same thing in 48. They would have been happy to escape with their lives in 67, but that doesn't mean 50 years later that the situation is the same. And the same thing was in the time of the Temple Mount when they conquered it. If they would have emptied it of everything and everybody in the heat of war, that would have been a different situation. So I would say that the Rebbe's approach nowadays would be not to go up on the Temple Mount, not to physically work on building the temple. However, studying about the temple, learning about the temple, that is an act of building it. You're preparing yourself spiritually, mentally for when the temple will be rebuilt. And it's also a catalyst for God to respond. Because we say when we study these laws, it is as if we built it. So that exists in many areas of Judaism where we don't have the ability to practice much of temple period Judaism. We study these things, the Mishnah, Talmud, Maimonides, and other things. In addition, every act we do, every mitzvah we do is an act of bringing this ultimate revelation, which will be good not just for the Jews, but for humanity. So when people ask me, Rabbi, what's going to be with the Dome of the Rock? What's going to be with the Waqf? What's going to be with the Muslims? I say, look, Maimonides says ultimately, all humanity is going to serve God. And they're going to serve God the traditional Jewish way. Not that they'll be Jews, but the Noahide covenant. And they'll be so happy to the temple in Jerusalem. They'll be so happy. All the nations will stream there. They're going to bring their offerings, their sacrifices. Those who were once Muslims and Christians will see, as Maimonides says, that the parents gave what they gave them was an error when the Mashiach comes. So I'm not worried about it now. There's a line that someone once told a rabbi or a rebbe. He said, what's going to happen if Mashiach comes and I, the Gentile, does not accept him? And the Rebbe said, if you don't accept him, I won't accept him either. In other words, it's going to be so clear to humanity that Mashiach is Mashiach, so then there won't be a struggle. They'll tear down and help build the temple on their own. Now, the mitzvah to build the temple, by the way, is men and women to build the temple with money or like the gifts of the Mishkan, except Tinoka Shabes Rabban, except children who are in school. We do not take kids away from Torah learning, from their schooling of Torah, even to build the temple. So this tells you the value of children studying Torah, that we do not stop, no vacation for them. They don't get to build the temple. They have to study Torah. We don't get their help. Going back to this, it is true from Maimonides, literally, it does seem that initially the first stages when Mashiach will come, there will be wars. The Rebbe's basic approach is that we've had this prolonged exile where it's been spread out. So at this point, we already merit the Mashiach should come in a miraculous way. If it comes in a miraculous way, so then all of humanity will be able to see instantaneously how God wants the temple for him, for us, for them, for the world. So it won't even be a struggle. So that's my personal belief. It's possible things may turn out other ways. There are all sorts of things that we did not expect that are happening in our world right now, that people could do all sorts of crazy things that will cause negative repercussions to fall back on their heads. So, but in general, our hope is that it should be done in a peaceful, loving manner that will be good for Jew and Gentile alike. All right, any thoughts? I do not know, Adina, the source for that. I'm assuming, there's, a midrash or something. There's no halacha about a place for Mashiach to live. It was rather an expression of people's faith that that Mashiach would come. But there's no mitzvah there at all. So the mitzvah, if you were asking about, what's best use of one's finances, I would say it would be built a school for children, not a home for Mashiach. Any other thoughts? You can unmute yourself, and if I said anything that seemed outrageous, please feel free to interject. I know I missed lots of things. I'm gonna have to call people by name. I feel like I'm in school now. So I'll call people and then ask you. No. All right, everyone. So next week, we're done with this course, this series. I'm gonna have to change the time because I'm davening. I'm leading services every night, and the time is getting later in New Haven because I'm in the year of mourning for my dad. So I'm gonna if we do it a little bit later, maybe 7:30 to 8:30. But again, if you want contemporary events through the eyes of Torah or something like this via Zoom or something else, let me know. Happy to. All right, everyone. Have a good Shabbos, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi. Have a
Shabbat
good
Shalom. Good to see you.